question.
Maybe we should announce that this is not an official meeting, we do not have a quorum as of this minute. So we are going to just discuss various subjects at this point in time, especially because we have Peter Britz here. So we want to utilize his knowledge at this point. So that's official. Okay.
And my question is as to the decision why that noise monitoring tower was placed at the entrance of the North Cemetery.
So my understanding is there's been a lot of concern about the trains idling
Mhm.
down on that part of the tracks. And they've been asking, and I think it's noise, it's also, I think, particulate emissions. Trying to get a sense of any they can detect there and whether it meets standards. So that's my best guess. I don't know for sure. No one's informed me.
There were different locations all around. Why did they have to put it right next to the entrance where
I think they probably want to get it where they could get a good reading, but that's a good question. I don't know how they chose the site.
it's obviously someone that doesn't know that you don't put something like that in a historic place.
Well, it's interesting to find out. The state may have not.
Suzanne might have more information on that. I just wasn't in the loop on how they said it, but you said it, might even be a city.
I was just gonna, that's what I was wondering too. I mean, one of us.
Somebody else will
It was, I read it that it was the state, but the city gave permission. So this is a state thing.
But it may not be permanent though, right?
No, it isn't permanent. It's just, I don't know how long it's gonna be there for, but it's like, I couldn't have found another place. It just feels like the place is. Would you have put that in the South Cemetery? At the entrance there next to the important grave?
So the question is, does it also measure vibrations? Which might be a good thing to measure near the cemetery.
Or they could have put it towards the back of the cemetery.
That's true
They could
too.
have put it on the other side of the cemetery, where there's just nothing. There is like a portion of land between cemetery and the railroad tracks. They could have put it in there. So what did they put it right there? I mean, right next to the entrance where they had the marker.
Can I give you a call in a couple of days or give you my number, Peter, and you could find out for us?
Sure.
Just, I mean, we
Yeah.
don't have to have the great details, but
Yeah, no, I can look into it. I don't have the details right now, so.
thank you. No problem. Carrie, we're not having an official,
So I just heard.
a meeting, so, but we can still discuss things. We just can't vote on approving minutes or what have you, so. I guess we don't have to do roll call. Yeah, really. So Peter, one of the major concerns, I don't know if you're aware, but we've divided our project into 11 different categories. And environmental was one of them that came up. And probably in this area, the biggest concern, thought, not only would be the water, especially down at Union and North Cemeteries where that retaining wall is falling apart. And the discussion had come up also that if we pay to get that fixed, then what kind of plantings and things like that we could do to help stop the erosion. But also if there were some way, I don't think anybody's building close to there, I'm not sure, I don't know all the plans, that we might wrap in some of that, not necessarily fixing the wall, but plantings of grass or that sort of thing. Or if there's a plan already for all that development that they're talking about around the pond, who's gonna safeguard, the erosion at that point in time?
Yeah, so I can answer the piece about the vegetation along the pond in terms of development in the city. There's been different plans. The city has a pretty evolved plan that's gotten funding from the state to do a living shoreline along the shoreline that's sort of behind 3S Art Space all the way towards the bridge until you get to the Rains Ave property there. So
But
there's
it's not coming back in.
It doesn't come all the way to the bridge. It goes, it's kind of on the corner,
Okay.
behind 3S Art Space and around the corner. So it'll be a city park on the upland part. And it's all part of the North Mill Pond Greenway, which is a connection between Bartlett Street and Market Street, but envision connection between Market Street and Bartlett Street. And so it's basically a trail, bike ped trail that'll go all along the shoreline of the North Mill Pond. That'll come across Maplewood into this area and then wrap around behind the pond up to Market Street. So it would be a connection from all the way down there for pedestrians in the downtown to get across town or up through that part of town. The living shoreline piece has some climate change resilience benefits to it because it's building in natural systems that have kind of been lost through the development of the shoreline and erosion that's going on. And so it's putting salt marsh and some mussel beds and then some upland things so that in effect, the vegetation protects the shoreline instead of like a hard seawall or something like that. And so they call it living. So it can actually move with sea level rise and it's meant to kind of adapt to sea level rise. So it's meant to be more resilient than like a seawall, which is another solution that can be used. And we can talk about that on our cemetery. And I'll show you some information about that.
So here's the causeway, you know, the North Cemetery is here, you're going across Causeway. The walkway is gonna encircle, it's gonna go across the causeway and all down and around and back,
So
or
we're-
just to the causeway?
So the plan includes the area behind where Cindy Young Cleaners used to be, up to the bridge.
Right,
Doesn't include the south side of that bridge right there, but it comes through the rail yard to Maplewood, then it goes on the road. And then we
oh,
go back
you mean dry side,
just a little bit up Maplewood and then go across. And then behind that part of the North Mill Pond all the way up to Market.
okay,
And on the southern part of the North Mill Pond, on the inside of Grand State Minerals, and then behind all the any development that happens, like that 105 Bartlett or Ritchie Lumber, all the way down to Bartlett,
so it will go down there on that side,
on the pond, right on the pond. Yeah.
okay,
The whole thing has, different parts of it have current salt marsh restoration or living shoreline type projects already in some places, and some would probably need some more work. But the area at the North Cemetery is a little different. They have a retaining wall there, and there's private properties beyond that that weren't included mainly because of the, you know, unknown nature of that area. And it seemed like there was a good connection along Maplewood where they have a plan for a better pedestrian bike improvement along Maplewood, which hasn't been put in. That would be part of the long term.
Will that be porous so that you're not shifting water?
The
off?
trail is envisioned to be porous the whole way.
so this is the back wall of the cemetery, and you're going down where the railroad tracks are. What kind of development is going down that side? It's further down, right? Not,
Right now, there's the Granite State Minerals salt pile there as you go down.
oh, is there?
Yeah, there's a big salt pile there. The railroad has a big sort yard, so they have several sidings next to the main rail line that cars can stack and be stored there because it's a rail yard. And then once you get a little ways down, basically the Ritchie Lumber and the brewing, what's it called? Great Rhythm Brewing and the dog walker place or doggy daycare place. That's has a development project that's been approved. It's contested and someone's taken it to court, but it's 105 Bartlett, it's known as. And so that has some residential and some parking, and that would go in, and on the water side of that would be the trail. So the trail would go on the,
Because there's already sort of a trail down in there, a road.
there is, but it's kind of private until you get to Ritchie Lumber, and then that's just a driveway, so. It would be improvements all along, but not all of them are completed yet, it's more a vision at this point.
So where the cemetery butts up to the railroad, that's, I mean, that's fine, but what pollution standards do they have, the railroad, for any kind of preventative measures? Anything that comes out of the cars or off the cars or whatever they bring in with them? Is there anything right now, or is that just a,
Yeah, they do, they have to follow the same, you know, federal laws other people follow, so the Clean Water Act and national pollution limits, discharge permits for big developments and things like that. There's not a lot of offloading or unloading that happens at that location, it's more just realigning trains and things like that. It seems like.
So I live right there. And a lot of us have complaints about they have the trains idling.
Yeah.
And the pollution that's associated with that. And I don't think there's a solution to that.
I don't think there's an answer yet, but before you came in, maybe, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Sue was asking about a monitoring tower that was there. And I think that was put in to try to monitor the noise and pollution.
And Sue, where is the location? Right near the entrance?
Yeah, Lenore Cemetery.
I'll have to
It's
look.
right
I
next to
haven't
the
been over
history
there.
board,
Yeah.
can't miss it,
Oh, Mark.
the big blue history board.
Yeah,
sign.
It's right near there.
It's right next to it.
Oh, boy, okay.
I was at
That's
that
supposed to be
intersection,
something.
ready to do a left turn, I'm on the left lane, and I'm like, looking over there, waiting for the light to change. What the hell is that?
'Cause that's
And
kind
I'm
of
like,
far
anybody behind me?
away- It's kind of far away from where the trains actually idle, which is further up toward Foundry.
Okay, like I said before, I'll have to look into it. 'Cause
Yeah,
I
I'll look
wasn't
into it
informed
too.
about how
That's
they got
interesting.
Yeah, we were trying, Susan wanted to know, who decided how it ended up, maybe you know.
Yeah, so I believe the Department of Environmental Services chose the locations. I can find out, Jane Farini, who's been in the legal department, who's been kind of coordinating on that, railroad piece. Let me see, she was in her office 5 minutes ago, so I will call up and see if she can come down. So if you have
Yeah,
questions
'cause
about
it's-
that specific issue.
Yeah.
And the challenge, of course, with the railroad, a lot of, we have limited authority as a local government, and that is part of our challenge, so.
Yeah.
You know,
I-
they have to follow certain federal rules, but we actually have very little, unfortunately, local control on a lot of issues with railroads.
Yeah,
But let me see if Jane can at least give any.
If they're on city property next to the entrance, is that city property?
They're on their own property.
They're on their own property
Yeah.
next to the entrance.
Well, I mean,
Well, I don't know about the tower. That's what we got.
So the tower may be on city property, we just don't know.
That entrance is Granite State Minerals, and then there's a North Cemetery. So it depends where it's
It
located.
is in the Lenore Cemetery.
It's in the North
it's
Cemetery.
in the North
Yeah.
Cemetery. I don't think the railroad functioning over there impacts the cemetery per se, or the wall, it's gonna be erosion from the tidal. So, so was that ever assessed, do you know, that, for future plans, like
Yeah,
with everything else they're doing, what they might just do right there?
in terms of the cemetery and.
Right,
Silver
the
Eyes.
erosion.
Yeah, that's what I thought you guys wanted a little background on, and then I can talk specifically about a couple places.
Oh, yeah.
But I
that's
can
great.
talk about what the city has done in terms of sea level rise and climate change. And it started in 2013 with the completion of a report, we call it the Coastal Resilience Initiative. So unfortunately, our systems are down, or I give you a slideshow with these links, but there's a link on the city's website if you just type in Coastal Resilience Initiative to the report that was done. And that report was really a first step at understanding the impacts the city was going to see from coastal flooding, from other climate change impacts, and from heavy rainfall events, and things like that, and looking at sea level rise over a longer term. And we mapped the whole city, the shoreline anyway, the city, and did different scenarios based on the International Panel on Climate Change's projections for sea level rise between now and 2100. And basically, the highest scenario was 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050, and 6 feet by 2100 sea level rise. And so we use that information to map out what areas would be impacted and where we'd see problems and issues, looking most closely at that coastal flooding piece. So there's both the sea level rise piece, which is sort of ongoing and will get worse on a daily basis. But the other big piece is the coastal storm surge. And so as we see more severe storms, even if it's not a change from the past, a severe storm on the coast will have a storm surge component to it. So the water that the storm blowing offshore basically pushes the water closer to shore and mounds it up. So you have higher tide levels on a coastal storm surge situation. And so they accounted for that as a 100-year storm and had a number for what a 100-year storm will be, and then added the sea level rise to that, and then mapped those different elevations based on that, and looked at what areas are impacted. And so one of the big results of that study, probably at least one result pertinent to what you guys are looking at, is that our historic districts are probably the most impacted in terms of the people where people live, in terms of sea level rise and coastal flooding, because it's a historic city. That's where the downtown was built. A lot of the building took place on fill, and when they fill old land, or when they filled it, just like in Boston and a lot of coastal cities, they only filled it enough so they could do commerce and build houses that didn't get flooded. So it was at the sea level then, so it wasn't extra feet above. So those areas are more vulnerable. The fill material isn't as strong, and water can move through it, things like that. So it's a more vulnerable area. So we determined from that study that we need to look closer at the historic district. So we did a second study with some funding from the Park Service that came out of Hurricane Sandy, and it was intended to look at future disasters and things like that, to avoid things like Hurricane Sandy having as big an impact. And so we got funding to look at the historic district. We looked at the areas in the historic district that are the most vulnerable on a bunch of different levels, but looking at historic character, looking at sites and structures, and came up with the idea was to see not only where we were vulnerable, but to try to give people a sense of what they could do. So we came up with adaptation strategies, or ways that people could fortify if it's a residence, to fortify the residence, or if it's a business, to fortify the business, or if it's a site, how to protect the site. And so that report, the Historic District Vulnerability Assessment, is also available online. It goes into all that detail. It has a lot of maps and information that you can pull up on the website and look at. But I printed out a couple sections because there's two areas that you guys are most interested in that were looked at specifically. And it's just not by chance, but because they're vulnerable, these cemeteries. The North Cemetery, which is called the North Mill Pond and Union Cemeteries in the report, because they never corrected the typo that we told them about. We had an engineering company out of Maine, GEI, do this report. And they looked at adaptation strategies that could be used at the North Cemetery and Union Cemeteries, and at the Point of Graves burial ground. And I'm not giving it to you to read through now. You can take it home and read it, but I can give you the highlights. I want to pass these around. This way. You can pass one that way and this way. They kind of give you a scenario of how you can try to make these areas more resilient or protect them. And so you can see kind of how the report was structured in this adaptation strategy, which they would identify a site or a location, and then they come up with, they give a little background, and they come up with different options. And looking first at the Point of Graves, they looked at fortifying the cemetery or accommodating. Basically, accommodating means letting the water come in. And so these options are kind of, there's a little detail in here about how you could do that. A little bit about what the cost would be if you were to raise that small wall that's in there, and about what that would mean. And then what would happen if you just accommodated the water and let it come in. And so on that, I just want to talk a little bit about that point. One of the things we found in looking at the vulnerability is, as I was talking, a lot of this area is built on fill. And so when we did this study, we realized that there's actually it's not just water coming up and over the land, but it's water making its way through the ground into people's basements and into areas that you don't necessarily see it on the surface, but it's coming in. So Strawberry Bank looked at that really closely. They've done a lot of work with that in this exhibit they have. If you guys have seen their new exhibit on sea level rise, they have a video that shows tide waters coming into a basement of a house over a king tide, and how that impacts it. We had an intern, while we were doing our study, go out around in the historic district and interview people and ask them about what they've seen for impacts. And they've seen significant impacts. People have basement flooding impacts that seem to be tidal related, but it's pretty early stages. We don't have a lot of information. There's some researchers at UNH that have been studying it and have seen impacts as far as 2 miles inland with groundwater changes and groundwater flooding. So That's gonna have to be another component of this, so just building a seawall isn't always the only option, but it is an option we're looking at. And we're looking at it as well for Prescott Park, and so it's really for the short term, it's something you probably have to do, protect your sites in the short term, but you also have to have that long-term vision of how you're gonna protect it in the long term. We can't just pick up and move everything right away, but eventually there might be sites that have to be moved or changed in a different way or figured out a way to accommodate this stormwater, seawater. So the fortify option is to build this seawall or taller wall around the Point of Graves. We've got an option in our Prescott Park master plan, which also is on the website. You can look at to build a seawall. The idea is it would basically be a seawall around where the most active parts of Prescott Park is. So if you know where the ornamental gardens are, that area is up a little higher than where the sheep warehouse is. And the idea would be to bring up the area where the sheep warehouse is up to a similar level, and Water Street, the street that goes in between, also up, and raise those grades so that we could protect those areas, bring them up, but also have an area in there where if water came in, we would have a low point to all go to, so it would collect the water. And so those are some of the things that have been looked at, and that will be, Prescott Park will probably be one of the first ones to actually move ahead. But in terms of the cemeteries, the other thought was on the North Cemetery and the Median Cemeteries. That has a seawall that goes along the shore. And this study looked at it and said, you know, you could fortify that seawall, but you'd have to wrap it up around the sides a little bit to protect it from sea level rise in the short term. But at a certain point, the water is going to come from the other side of the road as well, because you have the other side of Maplewood, water is going to make its way up there. And so it looks at both of those conditions and talks about it. And it's sort of a first step at how we can look at becoming more resilient to these impacts as they go forward. So I just wanted to give you guys the information so you can have it and look at it, but also I'd encourage you to go to the website and take a look more at these reports and try to get an understanding of it. And you know, over the years, I think the idea would be to look for funding both from the city and from grant programs to implement some of these actions, which will have a time frame for them going forward on how long they'll be protected, but at least it'll be a step. You're in the right place, Jane.
I don't have my mask.
Sorry.
I just have a quick question. So on the right side of Maplewood, you're talking about planted uplands and all that sort of stuff. So there's no plan for a seawall there, or is that gonna be?
Right now, there's not, but that, it is discussed a little bit in here. We could put a seawall on, fortify the wall that's there along Maplewood, but I think you'd have to almost completely wrap the cemetery with a wall to really protect it that way. And,
You could be going down deeper to.
well, that's the question. Would you need to? I think that's the work that hasn't really been looked at. What's the groundwater impact of this?
Did New York City look at this for Lower Manhattan? I think they had an issue there about sea level rising, and that would flood most of Wall Street eventually.
Yeah.
And most of their historic portions of the city, and I don't know what they decided or what they looked at, but it might be worth.
They did. They looked at a huge, a big Y or something, I think they called it, but a big circular protection program, really. It wasn't just seawalls. It was seawalls. It was some letting water come in certain places. It was berms and park areas and things like that. But it was looking holistically at the whole island of Manhattan and how they could protect certain areas. And that's what some other cities are trying to do and will need to do. You know, it depends how far out you're looking. You might be able to protect for a couple of feet in a certain way, and then when it gets higher, you might have to do different things, but I think it's a stepwise process.
No, this is really good information, and it's all under public works, right?
This is all, you'll find the reports in the planning department, on the planning department page. But if you just type in Coastal Resilience Initiative or Historic District Vulnerability Assessment, right on the main page in the search engine, you should be able to find it. Or contact me. Okay, bye.
Question for you. On this page, the second page, the second picture shows this is 2.5 feet. But it will look like at 2.5 feet sea level rise, the one on the right.
Yeah.
during a king tide.
Yeah, exactly. So this is on a really high tide, plus 2.5 feet of sea level rise. So how much further than it goes today, where it wouldn't come up on the shore there. With 2.5 feet of sea level rise, you're gonna have water going inland that doesn't go in.
How far inland is it going? Because it doesn't show the picture. How far inland is that? Is that maybe Pleasant Street?
It looks like it goes all the way through Strawberry Bank. It goes to Pleasant, doesn't go to Pleasant Street. Well, it does go to Pleasant Street from Strawberry Bank. It doesn't go from Point Grey. It does basically through Strawberry Bank. Probably pretty close to Pleasant.
Yeah, that's
I
Mechanic,
think it comes up a little bit at the end of Strawberry Bank, so take a little bit more to get it over to get to Pleasant.
Mechanic Street is totally on the water.
Yep.
Prescott's Park is totally on the water. Point of Graves is gonna be at least 2/3 of the way underwater. So it's like, you're talking heck of a
Right,
lot
so-
more important property that is gonna be underwater. The cemetery. I
It's
mean,
more than just the Point of Graves, right? But it is key to the Point of Graves, because we want to protect that historic component to it.
But
Just like these homes.
my point is, if you're gonna have all of these people and all of this property being flooded, I mean, as much as I like to have a historic property like that preserved, I would wanna give priority to the people that are, these are major property values that you're talking about,
Oh, yeah.
major property impact.
These are the tough questions. that are-
And so it's like, I don't know, what do you do with creating a wall? What kind of a wall do you have to create in order to be able to prevent that?
Well, in terms of the cemetery, it talks a little bit about it, but in terms of, there's other options for whole neighborhoods and things like that. You can raise the whole neighborhood, or you can either relocate it or put things on islands that are higher up structurally. But these are gonna be the tough questions that we have to address. And part of the reason we're doing this, we did these studies, is to give people a sense of what options there are. So these adaptation strategies weren't meant to be, here's everything we should do, but they're meant to be examples of different scenarios that could happen, and how you could protect yourself, at least for, some of the sea level rise.
Most of the downtown will be gone.
The
Oh,
historic part of downtown, not up in Market Square, they're up pretty high. But you're right, the
Yeah,
historic part of downtown is pretty vulnerable.
Rita, are you planning on staying? Can you stay? I just, oh, she just left.
So,
That's no problem. Well, just my personal observation is, now that we have this and we know that things have been considered about this, that, puts a whole different spin on where we prioritize something like this. I mean, obviously our first projects would be to clean up the graves, straighten them up and things like that. But keep this on down the list, knowing that this is really a much larger, instead of just fixing a wall and spending 40 grand or what have you, let's decide on what's gonna happen 50 years from now if we spend 40 here, balance out which thing would be the best approach. And also, new information comes along too. I don't know if anybody, is there some place where they've done the study or the data on the study of how much things have changed in the last 50 years in the river? As far
there
as-
is, and that's the thing. I think part of the reason it's not grabbing people's attention is that the change is accelerating. So they can track it now, they can see some change, but really, if you look at all the curves for sea level rise, they start slowly and then they rapidly increase. So I think as things increase, people will pay more attention to it as the
Right.
impacts continue. And then as big storms, so Hurricane Sandy got a lot of people, that's the reason they built that big wall around, want to build that big wall around New York City,
Right,
is because they had a 13-foot storm surge. If we had a 13-foot storm surge here, that would be a lot of water coming into the city, in effect, much greater than this. So it's really just about the potential and raising awareness. It's not taking that next step. To some degree, it's starting to take the next step. So it's a process, and we don't have a ton of time, we have a little bit of time to keep thinking about it. And then
historically, have they noted any type of super flooding that's happened in this area?
You know,
The storm, or what was it,
The biggest storm-
1939, was it, that we?
there was the hurricane in 39, the blizzard of 78 seems to be the highest point of modern time that people can remember. And we've asked a lot of people, so that seems to be the biggest indicator. That the National Weather Service is working on better tools to predict storm surges, because storm surges are really where you have an issue. In a king tide and a storm surge, you could have that 2.5 feet. You could have that kind of flooding pretty easily. So that's where the study is important and useful. You know, we'll have to revisit these numbers as the projections change, but it's really a way to start to understand where you're going to see impacts. And certainly these two sites are on the list.
Again, I think it's a great overview of how to prioritize the walls and these particular grave areas, so. Does anybody have any other questions on?
I have a question.
Yes,
Oh, thank you. So when you consider, the North Cemetery and Point of Graves, and those are places that are most visible, and that's also where visitors, would tend to go because they are so visible. Excuse me. But Peter, I also visited the South Street cemeteries. And when you go to the back, it goes all the way, the newer parts go all the way down to the water. There's no natural barrier there. And because it's less visible, it may not get the attention. I wonder if you think that, in our deliberations, we should consider it, or if the city has any thoughts about that particular cemetery as opposed to the ones we've been talking about.
Ava, I just wanted to let you know that portion that you're talking about is private, is a private.
Oh, it
cemetery.
is? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And that's one of the things on the list about doing subcommittees. There's so much misinformation in the world about our cemeteries here in Portsmouth. I spent a few days or nights looking at stuff, and any of these grave sites, including, they just lump it all together as South
Yeah, they
South
do. They
Cemetery.
do. And when I went and looked at markers, which cemetery is which, it isn't always clear.
No, it's not.
So if there was a storm surge, that private area would be wiped out, but would that affect something that the city needs to be concerned about?
No, that would be Mr. Griffin down here, who is on our committee, who owns 2 of those cemeteries, or his family does.
Okay,
And then the other one is owned by the Unitarian Church, right? There are actually 5 grave sites, cemeteries in there.
right.
So, and it's not that we should dismiss it, but certainly, in the future, collaboration between organizations is certainly a possibility,
Right.
especially with all the history that's here in this area, so.
And what about Strawberry Bank? Aren't they, do you know exactly what it is that they are doing? They're concerned about the water issue also. And just as a point of information, when I first moved to Portsmouth, I rented at Strawberry Bank when they first began to open up the tops of the buildings for rentals. And the building that I was in, whenever there was any kind of rain, just filled up with water enormously. So
Yeah, they've had to do quite a bit of work on some of the buildings. They've had to redo basements, elevate the basement, elevate some buildings, take out brick chimneys that were brick cook kitchens, I guess, in the basement, and remove them because the mortar on the brick was deteriorating because of the salt water intrusion in the basement and the moisture. So they're actively working on it, and they're trying to come up with ways to educate the public as well, like this exhibit. But it's going to be an ongoing issue for them, and they're going to keep watching it. But they're in a tough spot because that whole puddle dock area is filled.
it's
So
filled,
a lot
right?
of water goes through the ground easily there. And so that's one of the things, looking at future things the city is going to do. The city wants to look specifically at where groundwater is going to impact our sewer and water infrastructure that's underground, so we can prioritize what should be improved first. If tides come into a sewer line, you know, it's good about keeping the sewage from getting into the ground, but the water around the pipe will get into the pipe, and then we have to treat it at our treatment plant, and so it becomes an expense that we don't want to have to spend. So knowing where those vulnerable areas are first gives us, you know, we can prioritize replacing those lines first. Things like that.
Right, so I mean, the cemetery committee, I mean, we're only a tiny part of everything that's gonna, you know, people are forecasting for the future. But it's really nice to know, you know, there are plans out there and who we can dovetail with in the future. Not necessarily us, this group, but whoever, you know, keep us in the loop or keep in the loop with them so that, you know, we know what's going on and
Yeah.
work as a team as opposed to individual groups trying to solve a problem. Because you change one thing in land, you change everything, so it's not just as simple as that.
Well, that's part of why it's identified in the study, and it'll be, you know, looked at and potentially identified for
Right.
for these adaptation strategies as city properties come up.
And that's why I left the name of the person who does underwater archaeology on the list. Just in case
Yeah.
we need to.
No, I mean, that's good information. I would think, I don't know.
And how about Pleasant Street Cemetery, was that looked at all?
It wasn't in this study, but and like called out as one of the adaptation strategy areas, but I was thinking of that too when I was thinking about talking to you guys, because it does have, it's right on the South Mill Pond. It does have a little bit of a slope to it, I think.
Right.
Does a little bit better than these two maybe in terms of, but it's
But
not much. I mean,
It's a wetland though, I mean, most of the time.
lower end,
Yeah, probably lower 10 feet or so. I think even this summer when I was down in there, it still had some squish to it, so.
well, and that's another thing that we didn't really talk about, is some of these strategies to protect places from seawater end up trapping stormwater, so rainwater can't get like so if you get on Water Street, on that little street in between Prescott Park and the Rathskeller, if you notice when the tide's coming in on those sites, it comes in the storm drain first, because there's no gate to stop the water. So once you put a gate on that, or a flapper, or whatever you want to call it, a one-way valve, so seawater can't come in, then when the rain comes, it can't necessarily get out because it's held. So you could be trapping water, you know, upstream with some of these strategies. So you got to be careful that you're, you know, whether you have to put pumps in or what you're going to end up doing. But it's going to be a lot of engineering. Really.
So that means that the water like in back of the Elks Lodge. So, if you go a one-way valve there, so the water downstream from there on the creek will go up.
Yeah, I guess it could, but I don't think they can stop Sagamore Creek. I was thinking more just on the property itself.
Well,
Yeah, those are the kind of things you gotta look at. What's the secondary impact of these adaptation strategies that you want to prevent problems? You don't want to cause a problem by protecting something.
it's just like that particular location. I mean, you guys lived here all your life. As long as I live here, that area has been flooded. You know, it's almost like normal for the Rathskeller,
Yeah,
you know.
I think the other point that hasn't come up, isn't discussed very often, but say Point of Graves, if we really thought, not us, but going forward in the public. I mean, how much money do you put into it when the possibility that there are actually any human remains still there? It's simply still headstones. I mean, that's another thing you gotta take into, like, do you move all the headstones and move, you know, if there are some coffins remaining, that sort of thing, to move the headstones and not lose the physical history. You know, there are a lot of other things that are out there, but I don't think that's anything that, as a group here, that we would be faced with, but certainly it does make a difference how much money you invest in something. And cleaning headstones is not, I mean, while it costs some money, it's not, you know, $40,000 or $50,000 to repair or put in a retaining wall and all those kinds of things. So just food for thought, I guess.
So is there consideration to not allowing any more construction on wetland buffer and wetlands, especially near these cemeteries that are at risk, to keep that whole natural absorption and ebbing?
Well, it's a good point. The state has included, and so the city and the state both have wetland permit requirements. And so the cities has sort of a process to go through to show that you're not gonna create a further impact. It's more, a little more subjective maybe. The state has required a specific sea level rise analysis almost on every project you have to go through to show what the impact from sea level rise will be on that project. So what's the resilience of the property to sea level rise is part of the analysis you have to do. And so those are things that are gathered, they're getting put into the permit process.
So the percentage of permission to build on wetland and wetland buffers in Portsmouth, what is the percentage of denials versus approvals? Do you have an idea?
I don't think I can answer that because it's not, it's a pretty gray area. Approval versus denial, I mean, most things are a negotiation. They come to a point where they get approved, or they reduce their impacts, or they get denied, but I don't think there's. Look at them all.
Because isn't there one near the submarine and Cindy Ann Cleaners that was gonna build on wetland buffers or wetland?
There's, near City Ann Cleaners is Rains Avenue project, and they have some work in the buffer, but they also have a lot of. So it's all this balancing, it's up to the planning board and conservation commission to decide whether they meet that reduction of impact.
Yep, and if I could just follow up on that, I think the reason why it's very hard for Peter to kind of pick that apart is because it is very site specific. So for example, we have some sites that within that buffer, 100 feet to the wetland, to the water, you might have, if you will, all green. So it's grass or it's vegetated state. So you can go any number of places, a lot of water around Portsmouth. So this comes up a lot. And so some people might want to build a bigger house and they have, they back up to a water body or they have wetlands. And so what they have is mostly vegetation in the back. Then you've got our more compact downtown and you might have a mix. So within the 100-foot wetland buffer, you have maybe a little strip of 20 or 30 feet left, where there's some vegetation, maybe not great, but there's something. And then you may have developed portion. You may have old parking lot or an existing footprint of a building. And so that is kind of the challenge. When you look at these things, you really have to look piece by piece, because sometimes what happens, I've had this conversation any number of times on things not related to the Northfield Pond, we'll just take out the hot stuff. And what you'll find is someone comes in with a redevelopment project and they'll say, look, we're going to get rid of, how many, 1,200 square feet of some kind of pavement somewhere. And kind of restore an area that's in, close to more, better wetlands, but we want to impact 20 feet over here because that's going to allow us a radius for a truck to turn. So that's why it's very specific. Is it area that's already not green? And so what you're doing is actually, you're still impacting the buffer. So if you've got someone who wants to redevelop a property, and right now, 80%, 80 feet out of 20 feet in our buffer is already pavement. The question is, where do you make them go all the way back? If they're gonna redevelopment and leave a whole 100-foot, or is there some trading because you want a public walkway along the area? But it varies a lot depending on the property, because it depends, what does it already look like? And it varies from site to site. I mean, is that
Yeah,
fair?
I'd say, yeah, it's fair, and I think what the planning board and conservation commission try to do is to have a project in the end reduce the impact. So
Right.
even though they might have an impact in the buffer from the project, the overall project reduces the impacts that were there before they propose the project. So that's sort of the goal they look for.
It just doesn't seem that way coming from other areas that were near the water where it was just forbidden to build on the wetlands and the wetland buffers, who've come up here and after 20 or 30 years have not seen too many denials of construction on wetland buffers or wetlands. So I guess that was maybe
I'd
my
be curious, yeah. I mean, I think
unofficial
it's-
observation. I just wasn't quite sure.
I think some places might be a little more strict, but I think if you really drill down and look at those permit applications, you might find similarities. The really pristine areas, even in Portsmouth, don't get touched,
And that's
Either.
good to know.
but it's usually a balance.
So everyone does, if no one else has a question, I have a question about air pollution and acid rain. How that, if you guys follow that, and it may not, you wouldn't have the information, you know, for
Yeah. it's
what
not-
it has on
not part of-
cemeteries.
I know that it's certainly an impact to headstones, things like that. I don't have a lot of information.
Well, I was just curious too, because we've had so many summers now where if you're out of the shoals, you can, I mean, we're under those warnings of bad air or however that they do it, so they're more and more frequent at this point in time. So. But the city's not looking into any, not for headstones, I'm just talking about air quality.
So air quality, the EPA regulated says these non-attainment areas, so areas that have such high particulate matter that the area is in non-attainment, and they have too much pollution basically. And it's interesting because I've worked here about 20 years, and the first few years I worked here, there was a lot of days where the whole seacoast was in non-attainment. And it actually seems like it's gotten better. And I think a lot of that is pollution control measures on vehicles and things like that, and smokestacks and things. But I'm not an expert in it. It's really sort of it's an important topic, especially for tombstones. I know that for sure, is reducing that.
But
And
the
for-
state-
and for heavy, health issues as well.
So the state's the only one that monitors the air.
The EPA does as well.
I was just curious, no, you're absolutely right, because we lived through, you know, trying to get the pollution stop coming from the Midwest, because we're on the downside of that, so. Does anybody else have any questions for Peter or?
I don't know, Suzanne, did you get an answer about that?
I did. So there are 3 air monitors. I can sit up just. There are 3 air monitors. So the one, as you know, near the entrance to the North Cemetery. The second one is at the little Remick Electric Company near the Foundry Garage there in the back. And then they have a baseline one at the South Mill Playground, so that you have what's normal for Portsmouth, so to speak. And these locations were determined by the Department of Environmental Services, and they looked at the prevailing winds, among other things, so that's why you see one of them at the North Cemetery. And there is a live link called at purpleair.com, which allows you to actually look at the readings in real time. And there apparently was in one of the city newsletters, that link, that you might be able to Google it and find it, or we can distribute it. Once our email's more stable, I can redistribute the link. And the air monitoring will take place until the end of February.
All right, yeah, it was a short time, so.
And then the little monitors.
And I'm sure there'll be analysis of the data, because GS will be collecting the data, but there is some real-time data there if you want to look at.
Well, we could cover all kinds of things, like how many times do we have an earthquake go through Portsmouth? It's been a while.
You don't want to go there.
Don't jinx it.
I know. No, I'm just talking about environmental impacts on the city as a
So
whole,
it seems like this is really helpful context, but not that immediately useful. Is that how you're seeing it? I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
other than maybe making some funding decisions. Really, we should be talking more near-term stuff, right?
Well, yes, I mean, I'm glad because the walls were on part of our, to do this type of thing.
It's important.
Yeah, no, I see, like the air quality and what have you, that might make a difference on what kind of product we use, Michael. Isn't there even a new one out that's supposed to leave some sort of protective coat? Somebody was telling me about that.
I've only researched the one that I'm using.
and you use the detail.
It depends on the type of stone. So some products are really good on certain types of stones, but they will cause other types of stones to deteriorate. So I think it's a very stone construction specific issue. That you can use certain things on slate and certain things on granite and certain things on marble, but they're not all, I don't think there's one that's all inclusive that I've seen. So,
Yeah.
I think it's very specific. I think there have been cemeteries that have used cleaning or preservation materials that have, after maybe 5 or 10 years, caused the stone to deteriorate more than it might have otherwise. So I think it's one of those evolving things. It's something that worked 5 or 10 years ago may or may not work.
Right, isn't D2 biological? Yeah,
But if you have that specific information,
yeah.
we
I
can back
know.
it up. And we can just share
I
it.
know, but I think that Greenwood Cemetery has done a lot of that work. And that's what I had recommended.
Yeah,
Beacon.
if you could
So
look it up and.
I can see if I can get.
Send it, yeah, because my impression of it, and from Mr. Cyphers, who bought the cemetery, like this D2 is supposed to be like the really great new product that's out here and doesn't cause any long-term damage. And if you, once you've cleaned your stones and you're good for a couple of years, that you should go back and just spray, right? You shouldn't have to be cleaning anything, but to sort of whatever the chemical or the chemistry is between what happens to the stone and on the stone and this product.
Whether that particular stone wicks moisture up underneath whatever's preserving it may also be an issue, I'm not sure.
Right,
I think I did that, so.
right. No, that, those are all really valid points. And I think you're right, Carrie, that I'm hoping next time, since this wasn't a quorum, that next time, willing that the weather is good and it's not after the holidays. And I also think part of it was that we were all a little, or at least I know it, you know, if we were gonna be permanent. So now we are permanent, we can actually, you know, put the pedal to the metal and, did I say that right?
Do we have to reapply?
Yes, that's what I was just gonna.
Introduce.
Can we let Peter go?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you
Alright.
so much.
That's very helpful.
Sure, no
Yeah.
problem, nice to work with you guys. And don't forget to turn off the recording.
Thank you. And we can always contact you about any environment.
Certainly, of course, yep.
You're the man, okay?
All right, all right.
Thank you.
Always good to know Peter.
Yes, thank you.
So, so as you know, in December, the city council did establish a permanent cemetery committee. However, there are no official appointments to that cemetery committee yet because it is a process. So what Mayor McEachern agreed to do was to basically create you as a Mayor's Blue Ribbon Cemetery Committee, as you were before the creation of the permanent committee, so that you could have this meeting and feel like you could have continuity until the formal appointment process for the permanent committee could take place. So that's why it was unnecessary for you to do an application to, you know, continue on as the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Committee. He worked with the clerk's office to say, yep, that committee continues. So that has happened to tie us over until we can fully staff up, if you will, with members, the permanent committee. So if you are interested in being on the permanent committee, then do file the application to be on the permanent committee. Because as, you know, we were talking about, there were some members of the, you know, Mayor's Blue Ribbon Committee who've been more active than others. And so this is not a bad time to say, okay, are we ready? You know, who really wants to be part of the permanent committee? So, so I would say, once our website and everything is fully up and running, we're getting closer and closer now. Yeah, just go online if you haven't already, on the city clerk's section, And you can just fill out the application, indicate you want to be part of the cemetery committee, and then we'll just get you moving through the process. So our first city council meeting is on January 24th. And so what typically happens is the mayor will list his proposed appointments for the first meeting, and then at the next meeting, the city council votes on. So if you can get your applications in, next week sometime, we can get them all, the mayor can review them all, list them.
I submitted mine a month ago, should I resubmit it?
No, if you did it last month, that's fine.
So you're gonna send something out once your website is up with that information to us?
We could do
With the
that.
format?
Sure, we'll
whatever
send you the
want.
link and you can go right on
That would be
and
good.
tell you where it is. Okay. I will do that. Send link to apply. And I'll give you the date where we generally like that, because we put the agenda together, obviously, the week before the meeting, so I'll give you the deadline to stuff in, so we can get you on the list and make sure. Well, here,
So meanwhile, should Carrie and I follow up on this New Hampshire Historic Registry thing on who might be an amenable consultant and to meet with whoever to see in the historic community to see who might be helpful with that, or should we wait till we're?
No, you can certainly go ahead and see, how far you can get on it and what you can do. And, as I said, and I think I talked to you, I know we need the city's help, but I envision that, we'll try to fill out most of the paperwork that we need to do and then present it to you guys to have it reviewed. So, or if we need the information, we know we can get it from you. So,
So are we looking mostly at the New Hampshire Historic Registry, the federal historic registry?
I think we start out with just the, see how complicated it is,
To do the New Hampshire?
the New Hampshire one. Because I think like if we do that, we'll have a lot of information that can be transferred just to the national. And I think we have to be sponsored to the national one also. We can't just, we have to have people, I found an old draft online, I just stumbled across it. And this is the one they did in 1977, I don't know who, that's when City Hall was still at Daniel Street. And I don't even know, I can't even read the signatures on them. You have to be sponsored also. And in this one, there was a senator, state senator or congressman, I couldn't figure it out. That has to sponsor
I
us,
think
so,
that's why the person at the state of New Hampshire said you have to have a consultant who's done the application because it's a huge application. And I
right?
think it's pretty substantial for both the state and the federal.
Well,
And I didn't know if you want us to just look for state or look at both and see.
why don't we start with the state so that they'll be listed on more places if we get them, all 5 of them on the state registry. We'll start there and see what
And
happens.
are any of them already on the state registry or the federal registry? Not a single one in
Just north is on
North Carolina.
on the federal,
So it's on, north is on the fence.
right, North
There's
Cemetery
like
is the
10
national.
cemeteries on the New Hampshire Historic Registry. And the most recent one was in 2021, Somersworth, one of their cemeteries. Maybe we can talk to somebody from Somersworth.
Or we can talk to whichever consultant did that.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah. So I could find that out, the state. That's close by, right?
Yeah, some, yeah.
And Exeter.
I also have to tell you, it may not be, that's why I'm saying we get the stuff and start. I actually spoke to Ben Nelson, who's the director of Division of Historical Resources, in person, because he was at the December 18th at Fort Constitution. And they've started a specific person has been assigned cemeteries, and that the state is gonna start focusing on cemeteries.
You should know who that is.
Right, But I'll get you that information, but I'm just saying, there's lots of help out there, I just got this.
Oh, that's
So-
great.
So, if you guys wanna download all the information, review it and stuff, and then we can get together and take the next step after that. Cause also it's the first of the year, and so I found that everyone hasn't got back into the swing of things
It's in their office.
in the office and stuff, so.
The person I got was there by herself and the phone rang and she didn't have anybody else calling. So it turned out to be a really good time to call her around the holidays. She wasn't tied up with anybody else. So that worked out really well.
So Suzanne, is it Suzanne or Suzanne?
Suzanne.
I mean, that's what I always hear, they call you at the council meetings.
Yeah,
Suzanne, just-
yeah.
So you're gonna send us the link.
Yeah.
We'll get it in and then, he'll have the, presented at the January 24th and then they go every 2 weeks after that.
Yeah, I think the next one is the first week of February.
And so then you'll let us know after that, once they approve it.
The city council, the city clerk typically, right, notifies me.
Okay, but then how the setup is, if we need a counselor, if we need, the only thing I found, I looked up the research on it and there was hardly anything. So this is the only thing it said about how to elect people to boards. There was nothing on what was required of the boards other than to do attendance,
Right,
so.
we have the keeping of the minutes, for any meeting, that doesn't show there, but it's.
That's what,
but it's
yeah,
a public records request, so
okay,
it'll
You'll
be
let
just
us-
what you're doing now,
okay,
basically. So you need a form if you're gonna be voting, keep minutes, and generally we get the minutes have to be done in draft form, or the action sheet, really. Within 72 hours. And usually we try and get up on the website then, but as long as they're available if someone asks for them. So that's kind of your goal to shoot for, and we can always clean them up later, given that technically. 6.
yeah.
So,
Alright,
yeah, so it'll look just like you've been doing. You know, we've got co-chairs, you just wanna, once the permanent committee is fully staffed, you can, for formality's sake, re-elect your co-chairs. But other than that, not, really no changes for you guys.
great, thank you. Alright, so yeah, and so we can still go meet before February.
Like, how about next meeting?
Yeah,
Somebody asked that we change it to another day. Chris said he has an appointment at 4 o'clock on every Thursday, so he'd like to see us change it to another day. Or, but
gotcha. What would the next day be?
first Thursday in February is the 3rd.
I don't know, how does anybody else feel about that?
Depends, I don't know. This is okay. I don't
This
know.
works for me.
Yeah. Yeah, so,
And I'm flexible with other days, if that, most other days, not all. other days. But maybe if you just survey people and they said,
well, pretty much Thursday, it's either Tuesday or Thursday for me right now. I have other commitments, other days right now, won't be forever, but.
Well, Chris said he could try to change this appointment out, so maybe we should stick with Thursdays
Yeah.
and.
All right, yeah, so our next meeting will be Thursday, February what?
February 3rd?
So organized when I get here, but by the end of the meeting, my stuff is at my place.
Yes, February 3rd.
February 3rd.
that's a law of nature.
I just wanted to ask, did Peter leave his computer and phone there, or
No, that's the city.
that's the city's, okay.
Yeah. this is a permanent room that is set up for
Right.
Zoom meetings.
Right, I've seen it in use before, but I just wanted to check.
February 3rd. I think, the attendance will be better and stuff like that, we'll get send out notices further to remind people. And next, I really want to talk about next meeting about subcommittees to really get going on that, so we can pull stuff together. And then we can start talking about, like you said, what we can start doing in the spring as far as with what money we have and what projects we can start on, which I would assume would be, working on headstones, because they're the ones that look the worst right now. Prioritizing which cemetery and that sort of stuff.
I thought we had prioritized the two cemeteries that were the oldest and most at risk, Graves and North Cemetery. I thought that was,
Well, yes, I mean,
Okay,
that's,
so
they've been
the-
on the top of the list, but I need to start voting on, this is who we're gonna start, this is who's gonna do it, appropriate, apply for the money, different things like that, so. Okay. You have to vote on all those things.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Oh, yeah. You want-
Yeah, that's good. Oh, I wanted to show you.
Not in that quality condition.
Oh, good. Oh, then you already seen it, yeah. No, I was, I'm not gonna do it.